Percepts are stable under changing viewing conditions, perceptual constancies. The size of the image cast by an object onto our retinae varies with the distance to the object. For example, hold your hand out in front of you and then move it closer so it is now half the distance. This has increased the size of the image on your eyes by a factor of 4, but your percept of the size of your hand will not have changed. This is an example of a perceptual constancy. Objects out in the world tend to remain the same, at least over time periods of seconds, but the images they cast on our eyes constantly change as we and the objects move in relation to each other. If our percept was a direct copy of the retinal image, then we would see the world as constantly changing. This means the visual system has to actively interpret the retinal image in order to generate a percept of the stable, constant objects. In the case of generating a percept of size, the visual system takes the retinal image size and scales it by its estimate of the distance to the object. When we remove cues to distance, for example, when looking out of a flying aircraft, we cannot scale the retinal image so everything looks small. Note that this estimate of distance occurs at a subconscious level, and there is a figure 5.35 on page 178 of an old man in a chair in a hallway and another man on a chair further down the hallway, and then the next image is the same, but they have moved the picture of the man that was further down the hallway and put it beside the old man and shows the actual size difference. Size constancy based on distance cues causes us to perceive the person in the background as being of normal size. When the same stimulus is seen in the absence of the distance cues, size constancy breaks down. The two men no longer look similar in size. In addition to size constancy, other important constancies are those for shape, brightness and colour. The shape of the top of a cup sitting on a table looks circular, even though the shape of its image on our eyes is elliptical. The perceived brightness of objects stays the same even under varying luminance conditions, for example full sunlight and shade. This is due to visual cells being sensitive to contrast. The difference in luminance between an object and its background, which is usually constant. Similarly, the perceived colour of objects stays constant, even though changes in illumination alters the amounts of the different wavelengths they reflect. Thinking critically. Why does the rising moon look so big? Just before bedding down for the night on a camping trip, a friend of ours poked his head outside his tent and gasped to his wife, "Look at the moon, just look at the moon." Indeed, a gorgeous full moon had just come over the horizon, and it was so enormous that it dwarfed the mammoth peaks surrounding them. The couple gazed at it in wonder for a few minutes and then retired into their tent. Later that night, they looked outside again, only to see a rather small, ordinary full moon approaching the zenith. You too may have exclaimed over the size of a rising moon, only to notice later that the moon, well above the horizon, seems to have shrunk. What can explain this phenomenon? Think about it, then see the solution at the end of this chapter. Concept check. Perception involves both bottom-up response of sensory neurons and top-down processing, which is applying existing knowledge, attentional sets, to interpret the sensory representation. We cannot completely attend to more than one object at a time, but can rapidly shift our attention between multiple objects. Inattentional blindness is the failure to perceive certain stimuli while attending to other stimuli. The attentional system is especially vigilant to stimuli that represent a potential threat. The visual system has a tendency to group individual elements into global patterns. Gestalt psychologists developed a number of grouping laws. And perceptual constancies for shape, size, colour and brightness involve interpreting the distorted retinal images of objects so that we perceive the object as it is, rather than the changing retinal image. Perception of depth, distance and movement. The ability to adapt to a spatial world requires that we make fine distinctions involving distances and the movement of objects within the environment. Humans are capable of great precision in making such judgments. Consider the perceptual task facing a cricketer when batting. A fast ball travels at around 150 km per hour and typically hits the wicket 10 metres from the batsman, taking about 0.23 seconds to cover that remaining distance. However, given the raised seam on the ball and the variable surface of the wicket, it will change direction off the wicket. This means that when, for example, playing a bouncer, the batter has to judge the change in the direction of the ball and its likely height, and then decide whether to play a pull or hook shot or not to offer a shot and hence avoid the ball. To be able to do that, the player has to be able to predict when the ball will be in the region of space of about 10 cubic metres in size and to move in the appropriate position. And that must be completed in the final 0.23 seconds of the ball's approach. If the batter gets it wrong, he will likely execute a poor shot and maybe get out or even hit by the ball. The perceptual demands of such a task are imposing indeed. How does the visual perception system make such judgments? Depth and distance perception. One of the more intriguing aspects of visual perception is our ability to perceive depth. The retina receives information in only 2 dimensions, length and width, but the brain translates these cues into 3-dimensional perceptions. It does this by using both monocular depth cues, which is a key term and requiring only one eye, and binocular depth cues, also a key term which require both eyes. Monocular depth cues. Judging the relative distances of objects is one important key to perceiving depth. When artists paint on a flat canvas, they depend on a variety of monocular cues to create perceptions of depth in their pictures. One such cue involves incorporating patterns of light and shadow. Some street artists can skillfully use light and shadow to create 3-dimensional effects. See figure 5.37 on page 180. Another cue, linear perspective, refers to the perception that parallel lines converge or angle together one another as they recede in the distance. Thus, if you look down railway tracks, they appear to angle toward one another with increased distance, and we use this as a depth cue. The same occurs with the edges of a highway or the sides of a lift shaft. Interposition, in which objects closer to us may cut off part of our view, or more distant objects, provides another cue for distance and depth. An object's height in the horizontal plane provides another source of information. For example, a ship 8 kilometres offshore appears in a higher plane and closer to the horizon than does one that is only 1 to 2 kilometres from shore. Texture is a 5th cue because the texture or grain of an object appears finer as distance increases. Likewise, clarity can be an important cue for judging distance. We can see nearby hills more clearly than those that are far away, especially on hazy days. Relative size is yet another basis for distance judgments. If we see 2 objects that we know to be of similar size, then the one that looks smaller will be judged to be farther away, like those 2 men in the hallway. This cue may figure prominently in, for example, the moon illusion. None of these monocular cues involve movement of the objects, but a final monocular cue, motion parallax, tells us that if we are moving, nearby objects appear to move faster in the opposite direction than do far away ones. Like the other monocular cues, motion provides us with information that we can use to make judgments about distance and therefore about depth. Binocular depth cues. The most dramatic perceptions of depth arise with binocular depth cues, which require the use of both eyes. For an interesting binocular effect, hold your 2 index fingers about 15 centimetres in front of your eyes with their tips about 3 centimetres apart. Focus on your fingers first, then focus beyond them across the room. Doing so will produce the image of a 3rd finger between the other 2. This 3rd finger will disappear if you close either eye. Most of us are familiar with the delightful depth experiences provided by 3D movies watched through special glasses. These devices make use of the principle of binocular disparity, a key term in which each eye sees a slightly different image. Within the brain, the visual input from the 2 eyes is analysed by feature detectors that are attuned to depth. Some of the feature detectors respond only to stimuli that are either in front of or behind the point on which we are fixing our gaze. The responses of these depth-sensitive neurons are integrated to produce our perception of depth. A second binocular distance cue, convergence, another key term, is produced by feedback from the muscles that turn your eyes inward to view a close object. You can experience this cue by holding a finger about 30 centimetres in front of your face and then moving it slowly toward you. Messages sent to your brain by eye muscles move it with a depth cue. Perception of motion. And it's raining again, every time I record. Hi, welcome to Australia, where it now rains 360 days of the year. Given that motion is the change in location over time, the visual system could merely infer motion by detecting the change in the response of neurons that process location. That the brain contains cells that directly detect motion has long been known due to the observation of the motion after effect, also called the waterfall illusion. This observation goes back to the ancient Greeks. It is the phenomenon that occurs when, after watching something in motion, for instance a waterfall, for an extended time, 30 to 60 seconds, static objects such as the trees and rocks beside the waterfall appear to move in the opposite direction to the waterfall. The motion after effect can be accounted for by adaptation, reduced activation, of the motion-sensitive neurons tuned in to the adapting motion and the perception of motion being signalled by the relative activation of all motion neurons. Thus, when the static trees and rocks are looked at following adaptation, the downward sensitive neurons are firing less than the upward sensitive neurons, so motion is perceived vertically up. That also happens when you play Guitar Hero and then look at the carpet and the carpet starts moving like you're on an acid trip. Which I've never had because I don't want to look at things and see them moving like that. I'd be one of those people that freaks out and jumps out a 2-story window. As stated previously, a defining aspect of visual processing is that it occurs in hierarchical processing stages, which each higher stage extracting more complex information about the visual scene. The first level at which motion is extracted is the cortex, in the primary visual area V1. As already discussed, V1 neurons have small receptive fields. This limits the amount of information that they can extract. In the case of motion, this results in the aperture problem. Motion neurons are sensitive to motion at right angles to the preferred orientation to which they are tuned. When the edge of an object is larger than the neuron's receptive field, any movement along the orientation of that edge does not result in any change in the luminance falling on the neuron's receptive field. This means that the neuron can extract only the component of the object's edge motion at right angles to its orientation, if you can understand that. To extract the actual motion of the object, the output of many V1 motion neurons tuned to different locations and orientations need to be combined. This pooling appears to occur in a cortical area farther along the dorsal pathway, area V5/MT. Optic flow information is another important type of motion signal. This is the pattern of motion produced on your retinae as you move through the world. A radically expanding pattern indicates moving forward. A radially contracting pattern indicates a backward motion. A translational pattern indicates a motion parallel to a surface, and a circular pattern, the least common, indicates a circular motion. Optic flow is an important source of information for many activities, including maintaining balance. Try standing on one foot with your eyes open and then closed. It is much harder with your eyes closed when you have removed optic flow information. And the concept check. Monocular cues to depth include patterns of light and shadow, linear perspective, interposition, height in the horizontal plane, texture, clarity, relative size, and motion parallax. The two eyes see slightly different views of the world, which can result in binocular disparity, the images of objects being in slightly different relative locations in the two eyes. Binocular disparity is used to generate a perceptive depth, and convergence of the eyes is a second binocular cue to depth. Illusions, false perceptual hypotheses. Our analysis of perceptual hypotheses and constancies allows us to understand some interesting perceptual experiences known as illusions. That's a key term, meaning compelling but incorrect perceptions. There are two main types of illusions, sensory and perceptual. Sensory illusions occur due to limitations made in the encoding of sensory information. For example, as colour perception is mediated by the relative activation of 3 cone types with broadband sensitivity, this means that many different colours, different combination of wavelengths, look identical to us because they result in the same relative activation of the cones. This is how a colour television works. By changing the relative intensity of 3 pixels, red, green and blue, at each location on the screen, we can see a huge range of colours. Perceptual illusions can be thought of as erroneous perceptual hypotheses about the nature of the objects generating the retinal images. Both types of illusions provide important information about how our perceptual processes work under normal conditions. Ironically, most visual illusions can be attributed to perceptual constancies, another key term, that ordinarily help us perceive more accurately. For example, size constancy results in part from our ability to use distance cues to judge the size of objects. But as we saw in the discussion of the moon illusion, distance cues can sometimes fool us. In the Ponzo illusion, shown in figure 5.38, the depth cues of linear perspective, the tracks converging, and height of the horizontal plane provide distance cues that make the upper bar appear farther away than the lower bar. Because it seems farther away, the perceptual system concludes that the bar in the background must be larger than the bar in the foreground, despite the fact that the 2 bars cast retinal images of the same size. So look up the Ponzo illusion, and it's on page 182 in the text. Distance cues can be manipulated to create other size illusions. To illustrate this, Albert Ames, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, it's Ames, constructed a special room. Viewed through a peephole with one eye, the room scene presents a startling size reversal. Our perceptual system assumes that the room has a normal rectangular shape because, in fact, most rooms do. Monocular depth cues do not allow us to see that. In reality, the left corner of the room is twice as far away as the right corner. As a result, the visual system scales each image by the same amount, so we perceive the boy, whose image is larger, because he is actually closer, as being much bigger. Look that up too. It's called the Ames room or the Ames room or AMES room. The study of perceptual constancies shows that our perceptual hypotheses are strongly influenced by the context or surroundings in which a stimulus occurs. Figure 5.40 shows 2 examples of how context can produce illusory perceptions. Look up the Mueller-Lyer illusion. Thinking critically, explain this striking illusion. We'd like you to experience a truly interesting illusion. To do so, all you need is a piece of fairly heavy paper and a little patience. Fold the piece of paper lengthwise down the middle and set it on a table with one of the ends facing you like an open tent. Close one eye and from slightly above the object, stare at the midway point along the top of the fold of paper. After a while, the paper will suddenly stand up and look like a corner viewed from the inside. When this happens, gently move your head back and forth while continuing to view with one eye. The movement will produce a striking perception. Can you explain what you now see? Be patient with this one because I thought it wasn't going to work for me, and then all of a sudden it does pop up, stand up. And then when I moved my head backwards and forward, that just would sort of bend to the left a little bit. Some of the most intriguing perceptual distortions are produced when monocular depth cues are manipulated to produce a figure or scene whose individual parts make sense, but whose overall organisation is impossible in terms of our existing perceptual schemas. Figure 5.2 shows 3 impossible figures. In each case, our brain extracts information about depth from the individual features of the object, but when this information is put together and matched with our existing schemas, the percept that results simply doesn't make sense. The devil's tuning fork, for example, which is one of the images, could not exist in our universe. It is a 2-dimensional image containing paradoxical depth cues. Our brain, however, automatically interprets it as a 3-dimensional object and matches it with its internal schema of a fork. A bad fit indeed. The never-ending staircase provides another compelling example of an impossible scene that seems perfectly reasonable when we focus on it only on its individual elements. I used to look these up as paradoxical images. Illusions are not only personally and scientifically interesting, but they can have important real-life implications. Our research close-up describes one scientist's search for an illusion with life and death implications. Research close-up, stalking a deadly illusion. Introduction. When the Boeing company introduced the 727 jet airliner in the mid-1960s, it was the latest word in aviation technology. The aeroplane performed well in test flights, but 4 fatal crashes soon after it was placed in service raised fears that there might be a serious flaw in its design. The first accident occurred as the 727 made its approach to Chicago over Lake Michigan on a clear night. The plane plunged into the lake 30 kilometres offshore. About a month later, another 727 glided in over the Ohio River to land in Cincinnati. Unaccountably, it struck the ground about 3.5 metres below the runway elevation and burst into flames. The third accident occurred as an aircraft approached Salt Lake City over dark land. The lights of the city twinkled in the distance, but the plane made too rapid a descent and crashed short of the runway. Months later, a Japanese airliner approached Tokyo at night. The flight ended tragically as the plane, its landing gear not yet lowered, struck the waters of Tokyo Bay 10 kilometres from the runway. Analysis of these 4 accidents, as well as others, suggested a common pattern. All occurred at night under clear weather conditions, so the pilots were operating under visual flight rules rather than performing instrument landings. That is, they were landing the aircraft manually rather than using the autopilot, and they were using visual cues and the instruments, not relying solely on the instruments. In each instance, the plane was approaching city lights over dark areas of water or land. In all cases, the lights in the background terrain sloped upwards to varying degrees. Finally, all of the planes crashed short of the runway. These observations led a Boeing industrial psychologist, Conrad Kraft, to suspect that the cause of the crashes might be pilot error based on some sort of visual illusion. To test this possibility, Boeing engineers constructed an apparatus to simulate night landings. It consisted of a cockpit and a miniature lighted city named Nightertown. The city moved toward the cockpit on computer-controlled rollers, and it could be tilted to simulate various terrain slopes. The pilot could control the simulated airspeed and rate of climb and descent, and the Nightertown scene was controlled by the pilot's responses, just as a true visual scene would be. The participants were 12 experienced Boeing flight instructors who made virtual reality landings at Nightertown under the systematically varied conditions created by the computerized simulator. All of the landings were visual landings to test whether a visual illusion was occurring. Every aspect of their approach and the manner in which they controlled the aircraft was measured precisely. The flight instructors' landings were nearly flawless until Kraft duplicated the conditions of the fatal crashes by having the pilots approach an upward-sloping distant city over a dark area. When this occurred, the pilots were unable to detect the upward slope, assuming that the background city was flat and consistently overestimated their approach altitude. On a normal landing, the preferred altitude at 7.2 kilometres from the runway is about 378 metres. As figure 5.44 shows, the pilots approached at about this altitude when the simulated city was in a flat position, but when it was sloped upward, 11 of the 12 experienced pilot instructors crashed about 7.2 kilometres short of the runway. This study, considered a classic by many psychologists, showed the value of studying behaviour under highly controlled conditions and with precise measurements. By simulating the conditions under which the fatal crashes had occurred, Kraft identified the visual illusion that was the source of pilot error. He showed that the perceptual hypothesis of the flight instructors, like those of the pilots involved in the real crashes, were tragically incorrect. It would have been ironic if one of the finest jetliners ever built had been removed from service because of presumed mechanical defects, while other aircraft remained aloft at the risk of tragedy. Kraft's research not only saved the 727 from months or perhaps years of needless mechanical analysis, but, more important, it also identified a potentially deadly illusion and the precise conditions under which it occurred. On the basis of Kraft's findings, Boeing recommended that pilots attend carefully to their instruments when landing at night, even under perfect weather conditions. Today, commercial airline pilots are required to make instrument landings not only at night but also during the day. Concept check. There are 2 types of illusions: sensory, which result from how information is encoded by visual neurons, and perceptual, which involves errors in how the sensory representation is interpreted. Experience, critical periods, and perceptual development. The development of sensory and perceptual systems results from the interplay of biological and experiential